Hello, my name is Jason Demore, and welcome back to By Faith Bible Studies. We are in our second to last series looking at Solomon in Kings. Really exciting to be going through this, and has really been an awesome experience to study Solomon. And thank you so much for everyone who has been watching this series. Last week we started another part of Solomon's life, really the second half of Solomon's life. 1 Kings 9, 1 through 9 was our passage last week and served as a transition between the beginning of Solomon's life and the end of Solomon's life, which we're in now. And what we're going to be looking at this week is the tales of the second half of Solomon's life leading towards his death. 1 Kings 9, 1 through 9 taught us that the Davidic covenant is an unconditional covenant, a grant by God to his people that he will send his son as king over those who believe in him. However, we saw that it is conditional in the sense that everyone is still individually responsible for his own actions, and God will judge those who do not believe. And to place this passage where it is, right after the building of the temple, where Solomon does exactly what he's supposed to do and gives this incredible prayer, shows us that religion is not in place because God needs worshipers, but rather because God allows us to worship him. And we should always look at religion in that sense. Always look at Christianity in a sense of us being allowed to take part in God's glory. I did want to give a quick side note about my sermon last week. I mentioned that the Davidic covenant is the last time it is mentioned is in 1 Kings 9, 1 through 9. That is not actually correct, and I just wanted to alter that, point out my error, and say that the Davidic covenant is mentioned again in 1 Kings 11. God comes and speaks to Solomon a third time and mentions the Davidic covenant again. We will get there, and you'll see why that's important, but I just wanted to point that out there that I had made that error. So this week we are looking at 1 Kings 9, 10 through chapter 10, verse 13. Really going to be going through the middles of two chapters. And the reason I want to do that is because I feel that the end of chapter 9, stretching towards chapter 11, shows two different approaches to how to respond to 1 Kings 9, 1 through 9. And today we're going to look at the right response, living a life for the Lord, living a life for him in light of his covenants. And what I see here is a really practical application through many stories from Solomon on how we're supposed to act in response to the covenants God has given us. And then next week, we will see how not to hear this warning, how not to heed this warning, and what comes when you allow yourself to fall into sin. And we'll see how Solomon goes through that and is corrupted by the world and falls into sin. But this week is really the last time where we're going to see the good of Solomon and the good things that he does, and how honestly he was a man after God's own heart in many areas of his life. And there's some really good things that we can learn from him and learn from his wisdom. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to read 1 Kings 9, 1 through 5, the first half of what we looked at last week, and then I'm going to jump into our text, jumping over to verse 10. So let's read. 1 Kings 9, 1 through 9. 1 Kings 9, 1 through 5. Now it came about when Solomon had finished building the house of Yahweh and the king's house and all that Solomon desired to do, that Yahweh appeared to Solomon a second time as he had appeared to him at Gibeon. Yahweh said to him, I have heard your prayer and your supplication which you have made before me. I have consecrated this house which you have built by putting my name there forever, and my eyes and my heart will be there perpetually. As for you, if you will walk before me as your father David walked, in integrity of heart and uprightness, doing according to all that I have commanded you, and will keep my statutes and my ordinances, then I will establish the throne of your kingdom over Israel forever, just as I promised your father David, saying, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. Jumping to verse 10. It came about at the end of 20 years in which Solomon had built the two houses, the house of Yahweh and the king's house. Hiram king of Tyre had supplied Solomon with cedar and cypress, timber and gold according to all his desire. Then King Solomon gave Hiram 20 cities in the land of Galilee. So Hiram came out from Tyre to see the cities which Solomon had given them, and they did not please him. He said, what are these cities which you have given me, my brother? So they were called the land of Kabul to this day. And Hiram sent to the king 20 talents of gold. Now this is the account of the forced labor which King Solomon levied to build the house of Yahweh, his own house, the Millo, the wall of Jerusalem, Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. For Pharaoh king of Egypt had gone up and captured Gezer and burned it with fire, and killed the Canaanites who lived in the city, and had given it as a dowry to his daughter, Solomon's wife. So Solomon rebuilt Gezer and the lower Beth Horon, and Baalath and Tamar in the wilderness, in the land of Judah, and all the storage cities which Solomon had, even the cities for his chariots, and the cities for his horsemen, and all that it pleased Solomon to build in Jerusalem, in Lebanon, and in all the land under his rule. As for all the people who were left of the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, who were not of the sons of Israel, their descendants who were left after them in the land, whom the sons of Israel were unable to destroy utterly, from them Solomon levied forced laborers even to this day. But Solomon did not make slaves of the sons of Israel, for they were men of war, his servants, his princes, his captains, his chariot commanders, and his horsemen. These were the chief officers who were over Solomon's work, 550 who ruled over the people doing the work. As soon as Pharaoh's daughter came up from the city of David to her house, which Solomon had built for her, then he built the Millo. Now 3 times in a year Solomon offered burnt offering and peace offerings on the altar, which he built to Yahweh, burning incense with them on the altar, which was before Yahweh. So he finished the house. King Solomon also built a fleet of ships in Ezion Geber, which is near Eloth on the shore of the Red Sea, in the land of Edom. And Hiram sent his servants with the fleet, sailors who knew the sea, along with the servants of Solomon. They went to Ophir and took 420 talents of gold from there, and brought it to King Solomon. Now when the queen of Sheba heard about the fame of Solomon concerning the name of Yahweh, she came to test him with difficult questions. So she came to Jerusalem with a very large retinue, with camels carrying spices and very much gold and precious stones. When she came to Solomon, she spoke with him about all that was in her heart. Solomon answered all her questions, nothing was plain to her. When the queen of Sheba perceived all the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he had built, the food of his table, the seating of his servants, the attendance of his waiters in their attire, his cupbearers, and his stairway by which he went up to the house of Yahweh, there was no more spirit in her. Then she said to the king, "It was a true report which I heard in my own land about your words and your wisdom. Nevertheless, I did not believe the reports, until I came and my eyes had seen it. And behold, the half was not told me. You exceed in wisdom and prosperity the report which I heard. How blessed are your men, how blessed are these your servants who stand before you continually and hear your wisdom. Blessed be Yahweh your God, who delighted in you to set on the throne of Israel, because he made you king to do justice and righteousness." She gave the king 120 talents of gold and a very great amount of spices and precious stones. Never again did such abundance of spices come in as that which the queen of Sheba gave King Solomon. Also the ships of Hiram, which brought gold from Ophir, brought in from Ophir a very great number of almug trees and precious stones. The king made of the almug trees supports for the house of Yahweh and for the king's house. Also lyres and harps for the singers. Such almug trees have not come in again, nor have they been seen to this day. King Solomon gave to the queen of Sheba all her desires which she requested, beside what he gave her according to his royal bounty. Then she turned and went to her own land, together with her servants. This is the word of the living God. Let's pray. Dear Lord, I pray that you would just give me strength to be able to share this message, and that it would not be my words but your words would speak through me, Lord. And that as we looked at this text, we would see what the right response is when we are given blessings by you, Lord. And the right response is to use those blessings to live for you. So I pray that you would give us the ability to live for you, Lord, and the strength to continue in your walk in which you have called us to do. Amen. As I look at this text, there's so many stories, and there's so much about Solomon that is not in the Bible. And we'll get there and look at what I mean by that really next week. But, I mean, if you understand it, 1 Kings and Chronicles is really all we have about Solomon. There's not very many details, but for some reason, these stories have been included. And that means they're important. And they're important for historical context and to make the Bible more obvious that it is true by that historical context, but it also, I believe that there are messages and hidden truths that we can get out of this. I'm not going to be able to get into all of them, and I believe there are more to be gotten out of here, but I want to look at these stories and get out a couple truths. And you can look at this text and say, hey, here are the areas that Solomon is falling short, and this is leading to the fall of his kingdom. However, even though that probably is true, I'm going to do that next week, because I feel that the second half of chapter 10 moving into chapter 11 really focuses more on the fall of Solomon. So we're not going to look at that today. Rather, we're going to look at the good things that Solomon does and how it is an example to us of how we should act when we are blessed. Understanding that Solomon has been incredibly blessed by God. And because of those blessings, he does certain things. And I think those certain things can be a testament to how we should act when we are blessed by God. And so I'm going to split this into 5 different points. 5 points that tell us how we should respond to the blessings of God. And the first of these is that we are to remember God's promises and act accordingly to other people. And the way that we treat other people, the way we communicate with other people, should be in an understanding of God's promises towards us and his character of keeping his promises. 1 Kings 9:10 through 14 speaks about Solomon and Hiram's relationship. And it's a very interesting story that talks about Solomon giving Hiram some land, and then Hiram saying, I don't actually want your land. Your land is not very good for me. And so this leads us to this question is, did Solomon give Hiram bad land? Like, did Solomon give him a bad deal? Did he do the wrong thing here and give him land that Solomon knew would not be good? Now, I've looked at many commentaries on this, and there's different interpretations of it, but I think the best interpretation is this idea that the people that Hiram, king of Tyre, was king over were traders and loggers, and they had skills very different than the Israelites. That's why the Israelites went to these people for help in building the temple. The Israelites were farmers, so if we can assume that these lands given to Hiram were farming land, of course Hiram's not going to want that land because he's not a farmer. That is not his trade. That is not his people's trade. And so that land is not very good for him. Rather, I think this disagreement is included here so that we can see that there is a strong, real relationship between Hiram and Solomon. That even in these difficulties, Solomon keeps his side of the deal and Hiram keeps his side of the deal. Because look at verse 14. And Hiram sent the king 120 talents of gold. He gave him stuff even though this had happened. So obviously the friendship wasn't broken by this issue of the land. The other question that we have about this is it wrong for Solomon to sell Israelite land? And I don't think we can even ask that question because I don't think there is enough details. And I think the best answer is to say that the Abrahamic covenant, the land part of it, as I've discussed before, has not been fulfilled. So I don't see any problem in selling the land. But if you were worried about that, don't worry, because if we look at Chronicles, Hiram actually sells the land back because he doesn't like it so much. I don't think that those are the questions and the struggles of this verse that are important. Rather, I think it is important to look at Hiram and Solomon's relationship and focus on covenants. Let's turn real quick to 1 Kings 5:12. The first time we meet Hiram, king of Tyre, is in his relationship with David. But the first time that we meet Hiram, king of Tyre, and Solomon is in 1 Kings 5. And it says here in verse 12, Yahweh gave wisdom to Solomon just as he promised him, and there was peace between Hiram and Solomon, and the two of them made a covenant. Now, if we know anything about covenants, covenants are a very, very serious affair. And covenants should be taken very seriously. And God takes covenants very seriously. For reference, let's turn to Numbers 32. Numbers 30, verse 2. Numbers 30, verse 2 reads, If a man makes a vow to Yahweh, or takes an oath to bind himself with a binding obligation, he shall not violate his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. Keep your oaths. Keep your covenants. Obey these things you have said. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. This idea that is so odd for our time period is so prominent in the Bible. But I think it should lead us to the more general idea of we should be honorable people. We should hold true to our word. That if we make a covenant, a promise with someone, we should not break it. Verses 26 through 28 again detail this relationship between Solomon and Hiram. That Solomon and Hiram's sailors go out and go to Ophir and look for gold, and then they return in chapter 10, 11 through 12, bringing this gold. And we have this continued relationship. And I think in a political side to it, it is this idea that the way we should treat agreements, even politically, I mean, we're not kings, so this isn't as practical, is in honor, respect, and trustworthiness. But in a more practical sense, in your every day-to-day life, we should keep our promises. Why? Well, God has kept his covenants, and he has kept his promises towards us, because he never fails. So neither should we. Let's look at Numbers 23:19. Numbers 23:19. It says this, God is not a man that he should lie, nor a son of man that he should repent. Has he said, and will he not do it? Or has he spoken, and will he not make it good? What this verse shows us is that God keeps his commandments, and honestly, a lot of the time, man does not. But if we look at God's covenants, we hear his promises, we know he will obey his covenants, it should lead us to live a life where our yes is yes and our no is no, and we keep our promises towards people around us. That we remember what he's done for us and we do it for other people. God takes covenants very seriously. To really get the full extent of why I think this point is mentioned here, we have to turn to Amos. Amos is a prophet that was around the time before the fall of Judah to the Babylonians. And he prophesied about the destruction of Israel just like many of the other prophets did. But something he does differently that I find very interesting, some other prophets also do this, you can see this text in Ezekiel as well, is before he speaks about the judgment on Judah in chapter 2 moving forward, he speaks about the judgment on the surrounding nations and the surrounding nations that have done evil. And one of those nations is Tyre. Hear this. Thus says Yahweh, for 3 transgressions of Tyre, and for 4 I will not revoke its punishment. So Tyre has done something wrong, and God will not revoke his punishment on them. And then it says this, because they delivered up an entire population to Edom, and did not remember the covenant of brotherhood. Does that sound familiar? That covenant of brotherhood is the covenant that Solomon put between himself and Hiram. And now, from this particular text, we don't get the full idea of why the people of Tyre are evil in this time period that Amos writes this, but we see that one of the things they did wrong, the one that God takes the most seriously, is they broke the covenant of brotherhood. Not enough detail is given, but basically we can see that there was some slave trade going on with Edom, and enslaved Israelites were allowed to go through Tyre to Edom, and the people of Tyre didn't do anything. They let it happen. And because they let it happen, they broke the covenant of brotherhood. And God takes covenants very seriously. And that is why Tyre is prophesied to be destroyed. And 330 BC, Alexander the Great comes in and he destroys Tyre. And the prophecy comes true. And I think from this, we just really need to understand that God takes covenants very seriously and promises very seriously, and we should as well. And I think from Solomon, we can learn that. The next one that we have is in 1 Kings 9:15 through 23, a call to keep God's commands. We have this really interesting response to the nations that are around Israel. There are 3 really different things that are going on here. First of all, we have King Solomon's relationship with Egypt. And I think his relationship with Egypt is very interesting. I've spoken on this before, how his relationship with them started when he married Pharaoh's daughter. And I'm actually okay with that, because there are many verses that say that if they are brought into the people of Israel, if they forsake their gods and become Israelite in a sense, then it's not wrong. Also, God never judges it in Kings, and also the Egyptians are not part of that group that God said you cannot mingle with them. So the first relationship King Solomon has is with the Egyptians, which is a foreign nation, but it seems that they have a good relationship with them. And then our next characters are the Canaanites, who actually Pharaoh, probably with Solomon's approval, working together, destroys the Canaanites and destroys their Gezer, where they're living, and kills all of them. Now, if we remember from the laws, that was one of the things the Israelites were called to do. So this too is obedience. So not only is the first one of Solomon allowing other nations to have political union with Israel that they may work together, but also he's destroying those nations that God said you must destroy. He also mentions the Hittites, the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites. These people are put into forced labor, and this too is an obedience of God's commands. And for that, we have to turn to Deuteronomy 20, 10 through 11. Deuteronomy 20. In Deuteronomy 20, it details exactly how Israelites are supposed to deal with the enemy nations in the Promised Land. And starting in verse 10, it reads thus: When you approach a city to fight against it, you shall offer it up terms of peace. If it agrees to make peace with you and opens to you, then all the people who are found in it shall become your forced labor and shall serve you. However, if it does not make peace with you, but makes war against you, then you shall besiege it. And then it goes on at the very end of verse 17, but you shall utterly destroy them, the Hittite and the Amorite, the Canaanite and the Perizzite, the Hivite and the Jebusite, as Yahweh your God has commanded you, so that they may not teach you to do according to all their detestable things, which they have done for their gods, so they would sin against Yahweh your God. And what I think is fascinating about this text that we often ignore is that God shows mercy again to these people. That when the Israelites came into the Promised Land, if the cities realized that the Israelites were God's chosen people, realized their sin, and bowed themselves, they would become forced laborers, not slaughtered. But God says if they are not willing to become forced laborers, but instead go to war with you, destroy them. And here Solomon fulfills both of those commands. He utterly destroys the ones who God has called him to destroy, and he puts into forced labor the ones that are left over, the ones who have surrendered. He then also goes further and does not enslave the people of Israel. And there's many laws about that says that enslaving Israelites should be taken very seriously, and you should not do that because it's a resemblance of Egypt and understanding that the people are free. But rather, you should enslave or you force labor on enemy people. And this is not slavery that we think of today, because there's so many rules about how forced labor should be done rightly in the Old Testament. I'm not going to turn to those verses right there, but it's important to understand that what is going on here is exactly what God has called Israel to do. Not to mingle with the surrounding nations, but to either convince them that you are a holy nation like he did with the Egyptians and that they are rightfully there, destroy them like he did with the Canaanites, or put them into forced labor, having a sort of mercy towards them, but also a judgment towards them because of their sin. No mingling is going on here. And this is such a strong division from what happens in 1 Kings 11, where Solomon allows that mingling, but here he does not, and he follows the commands of God. And this is absolutely not a call for us. The practical application is not for us to go out and kill people who are evil. But it is rather this idea of whatever commandments God gives us to do, we are to do them. We are to obey them. We are not to mingle with the outside world. We are not to allow them to influence, but rather treat the surrounding nations, treat the world as if we are Christian and they are not. And there are commands that tell us how to do that. We are not in a time where we go out and kill them, but rather we go out and be loving towards them, but not allow them to influence you. And Solomon here clearly does not allow that. And it is once again Solomon keeping God's commands, doing what is right. Solomon remembers God's promises. Solomon keeps God's commands. And the third one is that he honors God's holiness. This is 1 Kings 9:24 through 25. Here, Pharaoh's daughter comes up again. And as I mentioned, I don't believe that Pharaoh's daughter was one of those 700 wives or the ones of those wives that led Solomon into evil. I do believe that she probably in some way converted to the Israelite religion, that she became a worshiper of Yahweh. I do believe that. But at the time, as we see here, she is currently living in the city of David, in the house that Solomon had built in the palace of David. And this palace of David was very near the temple. And verse 24 tells us very little, but basically that Pharaoh's daughter is taken from that palace and brought to a house that was built for her near Solomon's palace. But if we turn to 2 Chronicles 8:11, we get a little bit more detail, which, as I've spoken about, 2 Chronicles is really a retelling of everything that we've seen before from a different perspective. It says here, "Then Solomon brought Pharaoh's daughter up from the city of David to the house which he had built for her. For he said, 'My wife shall not dwell in the house of David, king of Israel, because the places are holy where the ark of Yahweh has entered.'" There is no explicit command saying that you cannot live even near the temple. But Solomon goes a step further and says, "I don't want even anyone living near the temple. I don't want anyone on that mount, so that the entire mountain is made holy to God." And this idea that God's presence is there, and we need to take that very seriously and respect that holiness and honor that holiness. And Solomon does that by removing his wife who was living there and bringing her away from there so that no one is living there and more holiness is there. It also is a reference to the problem of the Gentiles, that the Gentiles are not allowed that close into the temple because they are, in a sense, unholy. But as we know, if we look at the New Testament, changes are made and Jesus starts the new covenant where everyone is allowed to come and worship and everyone is allowed to come in. But at the moment, that is not the case. Israel is the holy nation, the chosen nation. And yes, Pharaoh's daughter can come and worship Yahweh, but she is not allowed that near to the temple. But honestly, I don't think that's totally the point. I think the point is this idea of devoting the entire temple to holiness and putting in extra effort and going above and beyond so that God's holiness can be honored and respected, and so that it is made very clear to the Israelites that this is a holy temple because it has the presence of a holy God indwelt in it, and it should be taken very seriously. Verse 25 goes on with this idea to say that Solomon offered burnt offerings and peace offerings on the altar which he built to Yahweh 3 times a year. These 3 times a year, one commentary from the John MacArthur Study Bible says that these are the 3 feasts. And I would agree with that, the 3 feasts being the Feast of Passover, the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Booths. All 3 of these reference Egypt and reference remembering the Exodus. The Passover most explicitly, the Passover being when they escaped from Exodus, but the Passover also is a foreshadowing of Jesus, the final Passover lamb. The Feast of Weeks and the Feast of Booths are 2 festivals that really talk about God's provision for his people and have to really do with agriculture and the seasons and taking care of the land which God has given to his people, and this idea that God provides, and which also shows that in the future Jesus will be that provider. And Solomon takes care to offer sacrifices and make these feasts important because he understands that God has put those feasts as an important thing in Leviticus. They are mentioned in Deuteronomy 16, 1 through 17, not Leviticus. And they're mentioned here, and Solomon has read this, and he knows this command, and so he obeys this command, and he understands that it is a sign of God's holiness and a sign of his provision, a sign of his care for his people. And so he goes to the temple and he uses the temple. And this is one of the verses in this passage that I find so fascinating. It says here, incense with them on the altar, which was before Yahweh, so he finished the house. This is not saying that he put in the last item on the house, he put the last stone. It's rather saying that the temple is complete when it is used. What a reminder this is to us that we do not have religion as a thing or, oh, we go to church, but rather it's this idea of we use the church. We use the church to worship. He uses the temple to worship. And that religion is not show and tell. It's not, hey, look at all of this and look how pretty it is, but rather it is an act of duty and something you do. That in offering these sacrifices, he is showing God's holiness and this idea that he needs to be made holy before God, and so that he may come in front of God's presence. And now in the new covenant, now that we have Jesus as the mediator, it is very similar of this idea that we must remember Jesus and go before him, through him, to God the Father, and worship and hear preaching and listen to the word and celebrate on Sundays and celebrate the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ and remember these things. And it's this act of duty. It's not just something that should be in the back of our minds like, oh, we built the temple, cool. No. Solomon makes it very clear here that the house is finished when it is used. Such a great reminder to us to take religion very seriously and to act on it. It is a religion of action. It is not a religion of sitting around. And if you're a Christian sitting around and you just see the temple and you don't do anything about it, then you're just wasting the gifts and the blessings that God has given us. But rather, Solomon sees the blessings that God has given them, and he uses them to glorify God more and more. We see this through these first three areas, how he deals with other people, remembering God's promises, how he keeps God's commands because he has the peace in Israel to do so, a blessing from God, and how he honors God's holiness by building the temple, but also honoring the temple and honoring the actions that go with the temple, shown all throughout Leviticus and shown in Deuteronomy 16, 1 through 17, of the feast, remembering this holy holiday. And lastly, with his blessings, he preaches God's goodness. 1 Kings 10, 1 through 13 is one of the most awesome passages, I think, in Kings, which is this depiction of the Queen of Sheba coming forward and blessing the Lord because of Solomon's blessings. It says here, I'm going to start in verse 4. When the Queen of Sheba perceived all the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he had built, the food of his table, the seating of his servants, the attendance of his waiters in their attire, his cupbearers, and his stairway by which he went up to the house of Yahweh, there was no more spirit in her. Then she said to the king, it was a true report which I heard in my own land about your words and your wisdom. Nevertheless, I did not believe the reports until I came and my eyes had seen it. And behold, the half was not told me. You exceed in wisdom and prosperity the report which I heard. How blessed are your men, how blessed are these your servants who stand before you continually and hear your wisdom. And let me stop there for a moment. If we read all of that, it leads us to the response that many people would have if they came to the temple of any pagan king, if they came to the kingdom of the great people, if they came to Babylon and saw Nebuchadnezzar and saw his great garden. They would say, look at all this awesome stuff. You are a god. In a sense, Solomon could be treated here as a god. I mean, pagan kings, this is how they were treated. I mean, if we go back to the Old Testament, we go back to Exodus, Pharaoh was a sort of god to the Egyptians. And so when God killed Pharaoh's firstborn in the last plague, it was God showing, no, Pharaoh, you are not a god. This idea that the kings of these nations were in a sense to be worshipped was a real thing. And so we read up to verse 8 and we see Queen of Sheba almost praising Solomon, but then she goes on and says, no, it's not you, Solomon. It's something so much greater. Blessed be Yahweh your God, who delighted in you to set you on the throne of Israel, because Yahweh loved Israel forever. Therefore he made you king to do justice and righteousness. I love this verse because it is a telling by the Queen of Sheba that everything that Solomon has is by the blessing of God, and it is to be used to do justice and righteousness. This idea that we should take the blessings that we are given to act with them, to act in righteousness, to act in holiness towards God. And as kings, he should be acting in justice as well and in discernment. What I love about the Queen of Sheba is that she is a Gentile coming from a nation, and she comes and she sees the light on the hill, Israel, doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing, a holy nation of priests glorifying God, and she sees the blessings and she sees God. And I do believe that the Queen of Sheba is saved here because it really further illustrates and shows this truth that the Queen of Sheba sees the blessings, and people should be able to see the blessings that are in our lives and look past them, look through them, ignore us in a sense, and see Jesus and see God the Father, who is the Father of lights and gives these blessings. And through this, we can preach God's goodness. I think this is such a powerful passage to me because as I go off to college, I'm going to be studying engineering. And the reason, honestly, I'm going to be studying engineering is so that I can make money in my future. And I'm going to have blessings from God, monetary blessings. And I don't want to use those blessings to glorify myself. And I know I will often be distracted to do that. But rather, our response should be that when we are given these blessings, to use them to glorify God, that people may see the blessings in us and see them and see God behind them, that he is the giver of these blessings. And then we have verse 13. And I think verse 13 is such a powerful passage, but such a devastating passage at the same time. The Queen of Sheba comes to Solomon. He sees his blessings. She sees God behind those blessings. She sees the wisdom of God in Solomon, and this is all Solomon can do. King Solomon gave to the Queen of Sheba all her desire which she requested, besides what he gave her according to his royal bounty. Then she turned and went to her own land together with her servants. Because Solomon has nothing to give. Because if he is not the giver of the blessings, what more does he have to give than monetary? What more does he have to give to the queen than riches of this world? And this is the truth about Solomon, is that yes, through the blessings from God the Father, we see Christ. But Solomon is not the Christ, and there's really nothing he can give. He should share the truth about God more, and he probably did do that, I would believe so, but he can't save the Queen of Sheba. He can't save her of her sins. He can't force her to worship at the temple and worship Yahweh more. Rather, all he can do is give her earthly riches. And this is really the folly of 1 Kings 10:13 and the struggle of Solomon, that no matter how great he is, and this theme is over and over again in Kings, no matter how great he is, no matter how much he uses his blessings for good, which he does, he uses them to deal rightly with other people, remembering God's promises. He uses his blessings to keep God's commands. He uses his blessings to honor God's holiness. And he uses his blessings to preach God's goodness. But he can't use his blessings to save people's souls. Rather, all he can do is give out those blessings. And this is how Solomon is not the Christ. But there is one who is the Christ, who is also given blessings by God the Father, by being the Son of God. But he did something so much greater, and this we have to turn to Matthew 12:42. Matthew 12:42 mentions the Queen of Sheba. It's a familiar text. It is probably labeled in your Bible, at least it might be, as the sign of Jonah. And really what happens here is the Pharisees ask for a sign. They want proof that Jesus is the Son of God, which is hilarious because it's very obvious by this point that he is the Son of God. And he gives the sign of Jonah. He says, look at Jonah, look at how he is a sign of the Christ. And Jonah, in a sense, is a type of Christ in what he does. But then he goes farther and he mentions a second Christ, or foreshadowing of the Christ. He mentions Solomon. Verse 42 says, the queen of the south will rise up with this generation at the judgment and will condemn it. The queen of the south being the queen of Sheba, because she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. And behold, something greater than Solomon is here. See, Jesus Christ came to the earth in humility, born in a manger, living in rather a poor family, traveling from house to house, never really having a home during his ministry. No riches, nothing like what Solomon had, but something so much greater than he would ever have. And the Pharisees knew the riches of Solomon. The Pharisees knew all the good things that Solomon did, and they knew the fall of Solomon. And now to look at Jesus, who is this greater Solomon, and this idea that Solomon is that sign, this reminder that use blessings for good, but remember who is the giver of those blessings, and remember the one who gives them, and remember who the Savior is. It's Jesus Christ. And I love how it says here, the queen of the south will rise up with this generation at the judgment and will condemn it. Because the Pharisees have seen the blessings, the great blessings of Jesus Christ, and they don't get it. I do believe that if the Pharisees had seen Solomon and all of his riches, they would have gone, you are blessed by God. But this man who has really nothing, this man who was crucified on the cross as a criminal, they can't see that he has everything. And this is the truth about blessings that we need to take into consideration, that when they are given, we are to use them for good. But when they are not present, we must remember that God is still a good God, and he still gives the greatest blessing of all, and that is salvation. The sign of Solomon is that blessings should be used for good, but they are not what saves. Rather, it is Jesus Christ, the one who in a earthly sense had no riches at all, but in a heavenly sense had abundant riches to give over and over and over again. And he gave these riches to the Queen of Sheba. And it's just such a beautiful callback to these verses we're looking at today. So I hope that this passage was helpful and that it shows that we must use God's blessings to do good for him. But remember that when we don't have those blessings, to remember we have the greatest blessing of all, and that blessing is so much greater than any other blessing we could have. And that is the blessing of Jesus Christ. That is not something monetary, but is rather something heavenly. It is something so great that we should share abundantly, understanding we do not give it, but only Jesus gives it. So let us live for him, understanding that he is the giver of eternal riches and the fullness of the wisdom of God. Thank you, and I'll see you next week.